Tonight's Words with Kel Richards.
Now, Kel, when we were both young, Latin was being taught in schools all over the place. I think it's probably still taught in some places. There's, I think, the Latin Mass. I don't know if there are churches that still do the Latin Mass. And then I think weren't there court cases or were there lawyers that used to use Latin?
There are occasional phrases in the law which are still Latin. So a court can be adjourned sine die, meaning to a date to be set. So it's not whole cases, but there are individual phrases that are still used by lawyers which are Latin.
Okay, all right. And of course the Latin, it's a dead language. There'll be people say, no, it's not dead. But, and you can read the original texts of Tacitus, whoever, I think I remember that from school. And
yes.
And of course it does then give you some idea of where a lot of the English language came from, doesn't it?
We've borrowed a huge number of words from Latin. Can I say the big risk that we have when we talk about a word which has been borrowed out of Latin is to then be told that we need to talk about when we do the word in the plural, we have to make it a Latin plural. So when someone was talking about a focus and they said, it's got more than one focus, it's got several foci. And I said, no, that's not how you make the plural. True, it came from Latin originally, but it's been borrowed from Latin into English, and once it's borrowed into English, it becomes an English word, and it's turned into plural in the way English turns words into plural by adding an S. So you don't talk about stadii, you talk about stadiums, that kind of thing. So that's the big trap with Latin, is to try to keep the rules of Latin, even though you're speaking English.
Yeah. All right. 131873 is the number. We've got some fascinating subjects tonight, including you wanted someone to go through a lot of the COVID cliches we've been using, so we're going to go through some of those if we can. I'm reluctant. I'm really reluctant here. Some of these I do worry about. Where is it here? Well, this is a simple one, actually. People saying important, where they say the D rather than the T. Not instead of saying important, they say important, which is again these are all, I guess being a lazy mouth, aren't they?
That's what we need. We need part of the campaign has to be a campaign against oral laziness. You know, it's just people who will not move the tongue from the back of the mouth to the front of the mouth in time to make the word properly. So D is made further back in the mouth and T is made right behind the teeth. And we've got to stop doing that. Come on. I mean, it's a respectable language. We need to show some respect for it.
Yep. We also had Les who emailed us. He was watching the block, so I suppose they used it, a cock-up. Well, we talk about a cock-up. When there's something goes wrong, you talk about a cock-up. Now, is there, we know what it means, and it's is onomatopoeic, is that the word that sounds like it is? Is that, am I using that correctly or not?
Well, onomatopoeic, yes, that's right. When a word like splash is onomatopoeic because it imitates the sound that it's. In fact, you talk about COVID cliches. The word cliche is onomatopoeic. It came into English from French, and it imitates the sound of metal type being clicked into place. Right. Because a cliche is a word which is over-familiar and used over and over and over again. When you set something in metal type, you can print it over and over and over again. So the word cliche was coined to imitate the clicking sound of the metal in typesetting coming together. So that's where the word cliche comes from. So there's a lot of onomatopoeic words in English, and yes, you've got the right word for it.
Yeah.
Now, for cock-up, I hunted through this and I thought it might be inherently rude, but it's not. It appears to go back. It's used the way we use it these days. It's relatively recent, 20th century, but it appears to go back to a male bird, a cockerel. And the idea was originally a cock-up was something which was, before it became something was just a mess, I got wrong, it was something which was really annoying. And the theory is that cockerels, roosters, that crow in the morning are extremely annoying, and it's what they do to wake you up. So a cock-up as being really irritated and really annoyed was originally that, and then became something which is just a mess and a mistake that you made. Yeah. So that seems to be the history of the word as far as I've been able to work it out so far.
Most interesting. All right, 131873. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back. I've got a very interesting question on the text line, which might require a bit of history. Also, a whole lot of COVID cliches you're going to explain to us. But if you want to call through, you want to talk directly to Kel, the lines are open right now. 131873 at 20 past 10. 131873 is the number now at 23 minutes past 10. We'll get to your call shortly. But I've got this interesting one here, Kel Richards. Tony, the word gay, of course, it used to mean happy. One of the greatest films of all time is The Gay Divorcee from the 1930s with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. And you pick that film up and, someone in their 20s might look at it and assume the story's quite a different story to what it actually is. So when did the word gay change its meaning? Because it would have been some decades ago, I assume.
Yes, you're quite right. The original meaning came into English from French and originally meant, as you said, happy or cheerful, and recorded from the 13th century, 1225, a long, long time ago. In 1922 is the earliest citation of the word gay being applied to a homosexual, but it was relatively rare. And it was in the 1970s that it became common. Right. So it's not until you get to about the 1970s, although it had been existed. Gay was applied at one stage to prostitutes. So when it was originally applied to homosexual people, to the LGBTQ, whatever the alphabet is now, community, when it was applied to them, it was meant to be a derogatory term. But as quite often happens, a community will take up a term that's applied to them in a derogatory fashion and make it their stamp and make it their brand. And that happened in the 1970s. So that's when it got... And by the way, since then, in the early 2000s, among young people, teenagers, the word gay was a negative term. If they didn't like something, they'd say, oh, that's so gay, meaning I don't like it, meaning it's bad. So it's gone through a number of phases.
Yeah, it's very hard. Look, and I'm going to sound like a really, really old-fashioned, stick in the mud, baby boomer, all of that. But I remember it was some years ago, but I raised on air, I said, when I first heard the term sick being used as something that was good.
Yes, yep.
And I had someone ring, I had a young person ring and say, you're 3 or 4 years out of date, and I hadn't even heard it. And apparently it was so. But I think now it's really hard to keep up, isn't it, with some of these terms?
Oh yes, slang, particularly the slang of the young, is the fastest changing segment of the language. You can't keep up with it. Can I say the one that really interests me is one word which stays with young people and remains current all the time. Yep. All the other words change, but it's the word cool.
Oh, yes, of course.
Cool has been around as a term of approbation from the first recorded amongst jazz musicians in New York in the late 1940s, became common in the 1950s, and it just never goes out of fashion. Yeah. The others come and go, but for some reason, cool never goes out of fashion. I find that fascinating.
It is fascinating. It is. Someone will probably do a PhD on that. Let's go to Faye, who's on the line with us now from Brisbane. Hello, Faye.
Yes, hello there.
Yes. What's your question for Kel?
Oh, yes. Kel, the words Indigenous and Aboriginal seem to have become interchangeable. Now, I was born in Brisbane, therefore I'm Indigenous to Brisbane, but my ethnicity is Caucasian, convict ancestry through and through. So am I Indigenous? Am I Aboriginal? What? We seem to be whitewashing the word Aboriginal. I don't seem to hear it very much anymore. It's Indigenous. And I'm Indigenous to Brisbane.
There's been a shift. Indigenous. Yep. Yes. Look, there's been a shift, and there's no Minister for Aboriginal Affairs in the federal government. He's now the Minister for Indigenous Affairs. Now, I'm not sure why that's happened. It may have happened in order to include Torres Strait Islanders. So they're wanting to say Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and putting it in one word and saying Indigenous. That may be the intention. Or it may be, as you say, that somehow or other they felt the word Aboriginal is an uncomfortable word. They are wrong. Aboriginal is a much better, stronger, clearer word than Indigenous, for the reason you pointed out. Indigenous means the place of your birth, where you were born. So if you were born in Australia, you are Indigenous to Australia, regardless of your ethnic or background, your DNA or whatever. Aboriginal means a descendant of Aboriginal inhabitants. The word, its meaning is built into the word, Aboriginal from the origin. So that's a much stronger term for people who want to claim that they are descended from the people who inhabited the land before 1788. So Aboriginal is a better word, and why it's been abandoned, I think it's a very unwise move that's been made, but it's been made officially by governments, and I think foolishly.
Yeah, and Faye is correct when she talks about the meaning of Indigenous would apply to her.
That's right. And you, I mean, you're Indigenous to Australia. I'm Indigenous to Australia. Everyone born here is. Okay. It means birth.
131873. That's and in the end, words have meaning, which is what this is all about.
That's right.
Rusty, hello.
Good evening, gentlemen. Cal, John. I wanted to ask Cal, why is it that in media these days, media presenters seem to be latching on to badly pronounced words, and it's running through everywhere, radio and television. And last week you went through vulnerable, and this time I need to pick you guys up on regularly and particularly. It drives me crazy. You just lose your respect when you say particularly and regularly.
Yeah, because it's regularly. But if you're speaking, and I'll be blunt, if you're speaking quickly and you go regularly because you're desperately trying to get to the news, and I think, all right, well, it should be regularly, which is about discipline, isn't it, Kel? That's what we should be doing.
Yep. It is. And can I say that your concern is really common. Recently, on my website, on Auswords, I had a whole flood of questions from readers to the website saying exactly what you're saying. Why is the media as sloppy as it now is? And I remember the time when there was training in the media, when
That's right.
young blokes like you and I came in, we were trained, we were mentored by people who were good at broadcasting and good at communication and good at the language. And I remember the great Arch McCurdy, who trained a whole lot of people. Now, that appears not to happen anymore. There's now a generation just coming in straight out of the classroom or, off the comic stage or off the street or whatever, and they sound like it. They sound like people who do not have the care for language and the passion for language that we had when we started out, John.
All right, I'm going to be very careful now, Rusty. Regularly, all right, particularly, because you've got your tongue. When you think about it, you look at it. Your tongue does a bit of quite a movement there as you're trying to get around that word. Which is, okay, thank you very much for that. Let's look at some of these COVID cliches, because you've got a list of them here. And I've actually got one straight away that I'm going to add to it that I've been seeing today. But let's go through some of these. Social distancing, that's something that's really come to the fore the last 18 months.
Yep, but it was coined 10 years before COVID. It was coined in 2009 during an outbreak of swine flu. And according to the Oxford English Dictionary, they've done a lot of digging, they say it was coined on Twitter. And I've got a feeling that's a lot of the future of the English language. You're going to look up the dictionaries and say, where did it come from? And we're going to be told it was coined by someone on Twitter. Anyway, that was the origin of social distancing. 2009.
Okay, hotspot?
Originally, it's now the place where COVID is prevalent, but originally it was coined in 1837 to mean a dangerous place where armed conflict is taking place. And I'm a bit concerned that using expressions like hotspot, which originally meant on a field of battle, the place that the sniper was aiming at, or that was under heavy artillery fire, is over-dramatising. I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist for decades, but I'm worried about how journalists are handling this. It's the coverage of COVID has been very tabloid, very dramatic. And I think expressions like hotspot are an example of that.
All right. Cases. We've heard a lot about cases.
Since 1325, it has meant any physical or mental state. But once again, what they actually mean is infections, not cases. But I don't understand why they switched. Why would they switch, John, from calling them infections to calling them cases? Are they worried that most people know that 95% of COVID infections are minor and there are either no symptoms or very minor symptoms? Cases, again, makes it sound a little more dramatic than infections.
All right,
which is
what about
it means.
stay-at-home orders? But we don't use that. We use lockdown.
Yes, lockdown is interesting. In 1973, the governor of a prison in Fresno, California, used the word for the first time to describe how he suppressed a riot in the prison. He locked all the prisoners in their cells for the day, and he called it a lockdown. And so since 1973, lockdown is applied mainly in prisons. So when there's a problem in a prison, you go into lockdown, and all the prisoners are locked in their cells every day. And if that sounds like what happens when you're under house arrest under COVID, you've got it exactly right. That was the original meaning. I mean, I suppose in our context of trying to deal with an infection, lockdown actually means quarantining the healthy.
Yep.
So you don't just quarantine the unhealthy, which is what quarantine used to mean. You quarantine the healthy as well, and that means you're using this old prison word of lockdown.
Okay, red zone. We talk about red zones.
Yeah, a red zone is another one from the war fields, the battlefields. It was coined at the end of World War One, 1918. They had to reclaim a whole lot of France where the trenches had gone through and where the battles had been fought, and they used to classify as red zones those areas which were dangerous to go into. So there were basically muddy fields full of trenches now empty of soldiers, but also full of unexploded munitions. That made them dangerous, so they were classified as red zones.
Yep.
That's where the term was first used. So it's that idea of danger being associated with a particular area.
Hermit kingdom, where we've shut ourselves off either as a state or a country from everyone else.
Well, I've just recently, in the last few days, I've come across this being referred to Western Australia, Queensland, New Zealand, and the whole of Australia. So it's become quite popular. The hermit kingdom, I'll give you the official Oxford definition. A hermit kingdom refers to any country, organisation or society which willfully walls itself off either metaphorically or physically from the rest of the world. It was, as far as I could find out, originally applied to the tiny kingdom of Bhutan, which is in the Himalayas, surrounded by India and China. And the royal family of Bhutan for a long time resisted the influx of the modern world and consequently was classified as a hermit kingdom. That's where the expression was coined.
Right.
Nowadays, it's most commonly applied, more than anywhere else, to North Korea. And it tends to be applied as a sardonic bit of journalism to call Australia or New Zealand a hermit kingdom.
Okay, look, I've got the last one here is double jabbed, and I mention it because I don't like the term jab. I've got a couple of text messages talking about jab versus vax, so I think there's a lot of people agree with me. I think it sounds like a very harsh term. I don't like it. I prefer to say vaccinated. What do you think?
Well, we've had this conversation before, and I've agreed with you, but... This is when the qualification comes in. But what I like, I've now decided, I've turned around, I've decided I like it because jab is a short, sharp word that conveys a sense of urgency.
Okay.
And that's where we're up to with vaccination.
I guess
so. That idea of a sense of urgency, I think, is a good one.
I've given
so
up
we
on
want
that.
to get to 80%.
Yep.
And so talking about double jab is short, sharp expression, suggests urgency. So although I agreed with you until now, I've done a little switch and I've decided that as we pursue 80%, it's not a bad expression.
All right, how do government's plans to open up the economy turn into roadmaps? They're talking about roadmaps.
Oh. Yeah, that's really interesting.
We're releasing our roadmap. Well, anyway, it's an interesting one. Yeah, have a look at that. We might talk about it next week. Roadmap.
Okay.
So,
can I ask you a question, by the way? I'm just doing a little survey, and this comes from a reader to the website. The word OFTEN.
Yeah.
How do you pronounce it?
I'd say often. I wouldn't say the T, but the T still often. I'd say often.
See, I'm the same as you. I would say often. This is what the reader to the website was asking me. Do we say the T or not? And I don't think we do. So I did a bit of research. My research says that the British pronunciation is what you and I say, which is also the Australian pronunciation often. The Americans pronounce it both ways.
Okay.
Some Americans will say often and some will say often. So I think often is an American influence and is best resisted.
Thank you very much. All right. Boyd says you referred to cliches earlier. He says, I avoid cliches like the plague. Very good, Boyd. Very good, mate.
Well done. He wouldn't touch one with a 40-foot pole.
Would not. Look, we'll take a break, come back. There's a few others we want to get to as well tonight at 22 minutes to 11. Talking words with Kel Richards. His website is ozwords.com.au. I think we've had this around for a few weeks. The UK Treasurer, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and some of those odd terms they have over there, Kel. What can we say about those?
Exchequer is really, really interesting. It goes back to William the Conqueror and when the Normans took over, and they established a thing called the Exchequer, which was the tax table. And the tax table was set out on a big sheet of vellum or something like that, and it was ruled into columns and lines so that you looked across the top and you looked down the side and you could find out what tax was able to be collected from this particular noble or that particular noble. So because it was in a checker pattern, it was called the Exchequer, and it was the tax table. So that's where the expression comes from. And so then the Treasury Department was called the Exchequer because it was their responsibility to look after the tax table and the collection of taxes.
Yep.
And the man who looked after the Treasury was the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Right.
So it comes from the same source as the word checkerboard.
Very interesting. All right, fantastic. All right, so now let's go February.
Yes.
There's a few different ones there.
February.
February.
February is really hard to say. The other one that's
is.
really hard, I find, is library. You've got to put two R's in there, close together.
That's true.
That's
very
hard
true.
one.
This is a word one from Rebecca. Interesting. I spoke to a solicitor today. It's spelt Cockburn, and a lot of, in most cases, you assume it's Coburn. She thought it was phonetical. She thought it was Cockburn. And they said, no, it's Coburn. But I know Milton Cockburn, for instance, was a very well-known journalist in the 80s. So different people pronounce it different ways, don't they?
That's right.
It's up to them.
The English pronunciation is Coburn. It's a bit like, there are a lot of English names like it. Mannering, which is spelt man-wearing, but pronounced Mannering.
That's right, Mannering.
There's Riven, which is spelled Ruthven, like Ruthven, but it's pronounced Riven. There's a heap of those words.
Well, Kel, I grew up around the corner from Ruthven Street, Bondi Junction. I lived there when I was quite young, and the Waverley bus depot. And so I spent the whole time I was there. I said, I'm going around to Ruthven Street. Because why wouldn't you? Why would you think it was Riven?
Right. Yes.
And suddenly someone said, no, it's Riven. I said, why would it be Riven? Anyway, all right, there you go.
Can I tell you, there is one English surname which is spelt Featherston-Haugh. If you spelt it out syllable by syllable, it says Featherston-Haugh, but the people who have that name pronounce it Fanshawe. Okay. Now, how do you get to that? I've got no idea, but they do.
Just a couple of quick ones. We won't be able to do all of these. I'm sorry. Steve is my dad used to call me and my brother's little gubbers, Gubbers. I don't know if you've heard that, or we can maybe take it as...
take that as homework, please.
Yeah, another person says they used to use Latin phrases ad nauseum. Thank you from John. There's quite a few of these coming through. Yvonne's a nurse and doesn't like the term jab. Like me, okay. I'm drawn to injections. I know it's a short term and I know it's talking about doing it quickly, but there you go. So... that's what we have there in relation to all of those words, Kel. So it is fascinating, isn't it? The use of language and the way it evolves. You just mentioned chess. There's a whole heap of things with chess, isn't there? In terms of the movement on the chessboard and the like. So we might even open that one up as well.
Yeah, actually, words from chess. That's a good idea. I'll see if I can find something for you.
All right, mate. Fantastic again. And if anyone wants to continue this with you, they can exchange ideas, words, throw suggestions up your way. Your website is auswords.com.au. There are links there to your books. There's lots of great resources, lots of great writing on there as well. And as I say, they can interact with you as well. Auswords, ozwords.com.au. Kel Richards, wordsmith, thank you very much again.
Talk to you next time, mate.
There he is, Kel Richards, at 11:15.